But how does Darwin and Humboldt connect? Well, Darwin read all the exploits by Mr. Humboldt, and he was deeply fascinated by that. When Darwin had the opportunity to join the Beagle, he actually did so without pay. He did this completely voluntarily. He wanted to step into the footsteps of Humboldt. And of course, Darwin is largely remembered for the origin of the species. I want to talk a little bit more about the geological aspects of Darwin's research. He later was actually the Secretary General of the Geological Society of London. And to his contemporaries, Darwin was actually more known as a geologist than anything else. Much of the exciting work that Humboldt produced was available in writing in various languages, and the information that Humboldt produced on Tenerife, and other people were there as well, Van Buch, for example, on La Palma. Darwin digested all of this, and he wanted to leave his own mark on science. So eventually, when the Beagle started to go south, they were approaching Tenerife, and in the diaries of Darwin, it says that he was almost in fever. He was so excited to go on land in Tenerife and see all these things for himself. But the Beagle was refused access to the port. The apparent reason was that there was a cholera epidemic. But if you look carefully, there was no cholera that year in Santa Cruz. And it's believed that it was actually more of a political move, that the Spanish authorities didn't want too many foreigners, and particularly not British ships, because it was only 30 years after Nelson tried to capture Santa Cruz. And this is one of the flags from the Emerald, one of Nelson's ships that was shot to pieces outside Santa Cruz. The flag is still in La Laguna in the museum. And the political tensions were strong at the time. So I think Darwin was falling victim to this, unfortunately, and we, as a scientific community, missed a great opportunity there. So not only us yesterday, but even Darwin couldn't go up to Taita, unfortunately. So it happens, I guess. But the voyage continues, and he then manages to go to other islands. He goes to the Cape Verde Islands, Ascension, and eventually, of course, he goes to the Galapagos Islands. So here, Darwin was, of course, familiar with this concept of basaltic rocks forming potentially from precipitation from ocean water. And although Humboldt initially agreed with this concept, Humboldt quickly changed his mind, and so did Darwin. And Darwin was aware that Humboldt had changed his mind, so maybe it wasn't too surprising that Darwin convinced himself rather swiftly that basaltic rocks actually form from volcanoes. So in the beginning, Darwin, however, was very shy. His observations, he also was very young on the Beagle trip. His observations are a bit wobbly, I guess we would say today. They're not very clear, they're not very decisive. And when he kind of comes to the Cape Verde Islands, he uses some terminology that are widely used for rocks, but he's not very fluent in it. So he's still learning on the way. But he quickly realizes volcanoes are made up of multiple layers of eruptive products, lava, and what we today call pyroclastic rocks, and that those are the processes that build up volcanic cones. And these are not uplifted ocean floor sediments, as some previous workers had claimed, like this gentleman here, Leopold von Buch, another naturalist. He went to the island of La Palma in 1815, and he argued that the crater here was a crater of elevation, that the initial ocean floor sediments would tilt up and open up this crater in the center, and that gives rise to these inclined formations of basaltic rock. So Van Buch pictured it a bit like a blister, is often said, a blister that swells up and therefore deforms these rocks. But Darwin will come to struggle with this, because in reality, ocean islands actually do lift up and they do sink. So while Darwin recognizes that these rocks form by deposition from a volcano, he also realizes islands can rise up. So Van Buch wasn't entirely wrong, and Darwin wasn't entirely right. So the evolution of corals and atolls, coral reefs and atolls is what Darwin is also quite famous for, at least in geological terms. And there was a little side project Darwin was tasked with by the Admiralty. They were very curious if these little ocean islands, these little coral atolls, etc., could be used as naval bases. So Darwin actually had to write a secret report after his return, and we'll come to his conclusions in a few minutes. So naturally, he looked at them while passing, and the Cape Verde rocks and Santiago, for example, they gave him much to think because he realized there was limestone high up on the cliffs. And limestone forms from the water. That's something that he knew and which we still accept today. So he realized that something that had formed in water is now high up on cliffs, meaning the island must have risen somehow. So, and this is where he got very kind of puzzled for a while, and where the different views from Van Buch and Humboldt and his were all blending into a complicated mishmash for some time, at least in his notes, before he eventually realized that islands are actually rising and sinking. And that is still true to this day. So here's an example from Gran Canaria, where we're going just now. Here we are at about 100 meters above sea level, and here we have limestone, and here we have lava, and this is in the north of the island, and this means the north of the island must have been uplifted by at least 100 meters out of the sea. Today we believe this is because new magma is pushing under the island and pushing the island up, but of course Darwin hadn't had the advantage of this information. So here's one of my former PhD students posing as a scale for this outcrop here, and here's the limestone, here's some beach pebbles, so this was marine, and then we have pillow lavas. This is typical for lava entering the sea, and all of this is 100 meters above sea level. So the uplift of these islands is nowadays a widely recognized phenomenon. So Galapagos was one of the major ports of call for Darwin, and when he then, after the Cape Verde visits, went there, he really kind of got fascinated by all the features there. One of the volcanoes there is named after him, actually, Darwin caldera, and this is Darwin caldera, and he sees that this crater was much above sea level, while other volcanoes were drowning into the sea, and this concept suddenly becomes very clear to him. The islands rise up and they sink again, depending on how much volcano pressure, how much magma pressure is under the island. So he then develops this concept of islands rising and falling, and he sees many examples on his journeys, and they bring the picture more and more clearly into sight for him. And when the islands start to sink, the coral reefs are still growing. So a sinking island will actually mean coral reefs are growing upwards, forming these atolls here. So here's a sunken island where the corals are trying to stay in the photic zone. They're trying to stay near the light, so they're growing rapidly upwards. But at some point, the corals lose the race because the island sinks too fast, and then they die. And he's then receiving information from people like Wallace from Indonesia, where he sees a similar kind of phenomena of these ring-type islands, and this together gives Darwin the clear idea of that islands are actually like living creatures. They grow and they reach a peak, and then they subside at some point again. So this concept is still true to the present day, and it's widely used for ocean island chains like Hawaii and also the Canary Islands. So we have an island growing out of the sea, usually fed from a stationary hot spot in the mantle, and the plate above might be moving, and the island initially is right under the feeder zone or right above the feeder zone. The island grows, but as soon as the plate is gradually moving away from the feeder zone, the islands are not receiving support anymore from this melting anomaly in the mantle, and they start to sink, and eventually they drown below the ocean. And, well, they make what we know as seamounts. These are mounts on the ocean floor, but they don't reach above the surface of the ocean anymore. So, because of his observations and the many different observations that he collects, he can actually come up with this concept. And this is very important because it actually helps him to work out the origin of the species, because in order to have different species of birds developing on different islands, he needs islands to appear and disappear so that they become stepping stones for migration. So the geology and his understanding of ocean islands was actually instrumental in the development of the concept of the evolution of species. So, regarding the use as naval bases, well, he recognized they're not the best of naval bases because they are only of temporary nature, and ultimately these islands rise and sink, and if there's volcanic eruptions on top of it, they are not very good, so his report to the Admiralty was not quite so positive. So Darwin publishes on the geology of volcanic islands in 1844. It's a major piece of work, but of course it's all superseded by the origin of the species that he publishes in the 1860s. After 1836, Darwin considers himself and establishes himself as a geologist. He becomes a fellow of the Geological Society of London. This is this building here, and this is the Geological Observations written by Charles Darwin, 1844. So, Darwin and volcanoes, 4 highlights. He falsifies the craters of elevation theory, but he comes to realize that there is a rise and a sinking of ocean islands, and this allows him to explain the evolution of coral reefs and atolls. And we didn't talk about that, but he also was one of the first to think about crystals in rocks. That's a different story. And the role of volcanic islands as natural laboratories for the evolution of species comes out of this work, which later led to this much more famous work, The Origin of Species, from the 1860s. So, thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, I hope you found this interesting. And as a small kind of consolation, even Darwin was refused access to the national park in his days. Thank you.